In this conversation, we're going to talk about the very common scenario for any hospital administrator, but even other institutions, where police officers will contact the facility and want certain information. And this was originally presented as a bit of a game show sort of format, so bear with me. We will try to plug through it in this video format. Um, First, let's talk a little bit about the history of confidentiality in Virginia. We won't spend a lot of time on that. And then we're going to talk about quite a few common scenarios that you as an administrator may have to field. Um, the interesting thing about confidentiality of healthcare information in Virginia is that it did not exist in Virginia common law. The Supreme Court of Virginia pointed out in the Gibson case in 1975 and again in 1992 in the Pierce versus Cadet case that at common law, meaning that in English law and the law of Virginia up until 1992, there was no such thing as confidentiality recognized by the law in Virginia. That was again somewhat surprising to healthcare providers who always thought that was the case. The Supreme Court did not actually recognize healthcare privacy until 1997 in the Curtis versus Fairfax Hospital case. That followed the enactment of HIPAA in 1996, which was implemented in 1997, the privacy rule coming into force in 2003. Virginia got into the act legislatively the same year as the Supreme Court suddenly recognized patient privacy in 1997 with the Patient Health Records Privacy Act, which is found at Virginia Code 32.1-127.1:03 for those of you who are keeping score at home. These are the scenarios that we're going to talk about, and I use the term Billy Bob not in a disparaging way, but since we are in Virginia, we can talk like Southerners, and we will run with it. So we'll take up these 5 scenarios and see if you can answer the questions before we get to them. Is Billy Bob in your hospital? Says the police officer. What can you say? Well, you can actually say quite a lot in that you can identify the name, you can identify the location, their general condition, unless they have specifically requested not to be on the public register. It is the same for every patient in that a hospital can keep a directory of people who are in the facility as they historically have done and share that with anyone who asks unless the patient specifically requests to be removed from that registry. The more interesting question is, can you share with the police officer when that patient is going to be discharged? Your friends at HIPAA or in the Virginia statute do not give you any specific guidance about that question. So you're a little bit in uncharted territory there. Tell us about Billy Bob. Police officer comes and says, we have reason to believe that Billy Bob was the victim of crime or that he was the perpetrator. What can you tell us about him? Well, you may be surprised to learn that you can share all of this information with a police officer who says that it's important that they know that sort of information. Again, it is up to the police officer to make that determination. When Billy Bob got whacked, this is not The Sopranos. This is Billy Bob is a patient in your ER, and they have a violently inflicted wound. What can you tell them about Billy Bob, the victim at that point? And this requires a balancing test that you balance what is needed by the police to conduct their investigation versus the police telling you that they will not use that information against the patient, and that what is in the best interest of the patient going forward, and factoring in also that they need that information now because of it will materially advance an investigation and potentially protect others. That is, of course, a bit of a challenging test to be conducting at the bedside under a lot of stress, but that is how it is defined in HIPAA. you will find under the Healthcare Decisions Act that it is the person in the pecking order who determines whether or not information may be released. And so you may run into an interesting phenomena that where a patient is unconscious, the spouse, let's say just for kicks and grins, the husband, is the one who would be making the decision of what information could be released for that patient. And actually, he's being accused of domestic violence. Um, what is one to do in that situation? Does the Healthcare Decisions Act trump what a police officer may be informed of? And the answer may well be yes. In that situation, the police officer is always welcome to obtain a search warrant to obtain that information, but without the decision maker's consent, they may not have a right to that information. So be careful in that scenario. Likewise, you also have an obligation under most circumstances to report any victim of a violent crime, and that would be including the patient's name and last known address. Billy Bob does bad things in your detox unit. What can you tell the police? And in that scenario, we know that sometimes people in detox units do bad things. They may get into fights, they may steal things, they may set things on fire. What is it, if Billy Bob does that, that you can tell the police? When Billy Bob's in your detox unit doing bad things, you can tell them this. You can tell them the name, the address. You can tell them his status. You can tell them where he is, his last known whereabouts. That may be running out the door. And you can describe the facts of the crime. What you may not be at liberty to do is to disclose the identity of other patients who may be witnesses or potentially even victims without their consent because of 42 CFR Part 2, the drug detox regulations. So be careful when you have events that do occur on the detox unit. It requires a much more strategic disclosure of information. What if Billy Bob was making threats? Well, we've covered this already in a prior talk about your duty to warn, and here's what you must say to the police or to other folks. That if you have a reasonable concern that this patient has the wherewithal to carry out this threat. These are the 5 things that you can do to meet your obligation. We've covered those previously. Again, you aren't granted the right to detain that patient, but you are given certain immunities. Let's say Billy Bob is a student, and that may be a medical student, a nursing student. It may be that you are the healthcare provider on a university campus. What would you say to the police if they come to ask you questions? Well, you can say exactly the same thing you would for any other patient, but you need to be conscious of the Educational Privacy Acts, referred to as FERPA, FERPA, that is very analogous to HIPAA, that requires that the patient or that the student authorize any disclosure of educational information. It becomes challenging because if you are a university or a school healthcare provider, there may be files that are medical healthcare information, and that should be kept in one file. There may be information that is educational information but it may involve intelligent testing. It may involve behavioral testing. If those are for the purpose of education, then that has to be kept in a separate file, and those are subject to the FERPA regulations, as opposed to records that you may be keeping in another file for the patient's health. Those have to be kept under the HIPAA regulations. And so it can become quite challenging if you are potentially wearing 2 different hats in the process, but you do need to be conscious of that distinction. For today's trivia quiz, here's a Latin term for you. You get bonus points for yourself. because it doesn't really count for the school term, but what does re nullius mean? That's the end of our conversation on police inquiries. Again, it's a very important topic, and I recommend to you that you review the textbook discussion of that so that you'll be ready when a police officer comes knocking at your door.